thank you all for coming to another of this year's Diaspora Talk Lecture Series. Today we have joining us Dr. Quincy Mills from Vassar College. And I want to thank as well, before we get started, the director of the L.Warfield Center, Dr. Sherry Smith, for allowing me to coordinate this year's lecture series. The L.Warfield Center staff for providing us water, some treats in the back, as well as the logistics of getting the room together. And particularly Stephanie Lang for her work in helping get everything organized with the flyers and to keep me on task to make sure I had everything together. I'm Dr. Quincy Mills in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department. And we're going to turn back to our guest today, Dr. Quincy Mills, who comes to us from Vassar College in upstate New York, where he is associate professor of history. Dr. Mills is a native of the South Side of Chicago, and he earned his bachelor's degree in business from the University of Illinois in Champaign, graduating in 1997. We actually overlapped 1 year. My first year of graduate school at Illinois was his last year. And I then later found out, by happenstance, I think on the U of Chicago campus, that he had left a burgeoning career in the insurance industry and enrolled at the University of Chicago in the history department, where he earned his PhD in 2006. And Dr. Mills has quickly established himself as one among an ever-growing field of historians working in Black business history, which includes both our current UT faculty member in the history department, Juliet E.K. Walker, as well as our former colleague, now at the University of Delaware, Tiffany Gill, who works on Black uniform, or worked at least on Black uniforms. Dr. Mills' ranging intellectual interests include a concern for how African Americans' wages, wealth, and overall financial well-being help shape Black public spaces, political engagement, and activism. And he is here today to talk to us about his first book, Cutting Along the Color Line, Black Barbers and Barbershops in America. And this is from the University of Pennsylvania Press. Very well done, much more readable than its thickness might suggest. It goes by very quickly. And this chronicles the history of Black barbershops as businesses and civic institutions, demonstrating their central role in civil rights struggles throughout the 19th and 20th century. So I just want to read a couple of blurbs from the back. One, and you'll see why, one blurb praising the book is from Zareth, the barber to President Barack Obama. Quincy T. Mills' important book provides fascinating insight into the history of African American barbers. He vividly captures their culture, traditions, and perseverance to succeed against tremendous odds. A brilliant overview of this prestigious tradition, as well as a blurb from Melissa Harris Perry, with whom Dr. Mills co-authored a chapter of her first book, which I don't remember the title. But Dr. Harris Perry says, cutting along the color line is a singular achievement. Quincy Mills has taken a familiar institution, the neighborhood barbershop, and revealed an unknown history that utterly transforms our understanding of what we thought it was, unpacking the economic, social, cultural, and political history of Black barbering from slavery to the present, contributes new insights to African American studies, American history, and Black masculinities. Cutting along the color line will have a permanent place on my syllabus and on a number of our syllabi. In addition to cutting along the color line, Quincy Mills has also co-edited a book with Benjamin Talton entitled Black Subjects in Africa and its Diaspora, Race and Gender in Research and Writing. I actually have the title written down. The chapter that he co-authored in Melissa Harris Perry's book is called Truth and Soul, Black Talk in the Barbershop. And this is in her book, Barbershops, Bibles, and BET. And he's also currently working on a second monograph that I think he might speak to us briefly about, tentatively titled The Wages of Resistance, Financing the Black Freedom Movement, which examines how civil rights and political organizations negotiated fundraising imperatives with their political ideologies as functions of movement building. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Quincy Mills.
so much for having me. It's certainly an honor. Mika is a very dear friend and colleague, and Professor Stuart Walker. As Mika said, I was a business major undergrad, took a lot of history classes, and as we all should do as faculty, she saw something in me that I didn't see, and she said you should really consider a career in academia. As a kid from black kid from the South Side, I was steered toward the professions, right? That's where you go to sort of demonstrate that you made it, that you've done something. And so I really appreciate her for suggesting that the study of history could be quite fruitful for what I was set out to do. And so I'm glad that I listened. Certainly glad that I have wonderful colleagues like Mika to develop some wonderful ideas off of. So I'm going to start with this short clip from the 2002 movie Barbershop, and then I'll get into some other things in a second.
And they was on the front line in the 60s.
Oh,
Who the hell is Rosa Parks?
Who's Rosa Parks?
He's only the founder of the modern civil rights movement.
Yeah, well, because she said her ass down on the bus. Oh, Eddie, you know who Rosa Parks is. Man, she was tired. That's what you do when you're tired. You sit your ass down. I sat down on the bus and I got thrown in jail. Ain't hear from nobody no more. Laptops, computers, just like I told you to. No. You need to hear this. You sit down. You need to hear this too. Sit down, Rachel. Now, I probably wouldn't say this in front of white folks, but in front of your own speak my mind. Rosa Parks ain't do nothing but sit her black ass down. Hold on, outside there. You might learn something right now. I'm gonna give her a just due. I'm gonna give her a just due for what she did, her act, led to the movement and everything. But she damn sure ain't special. No, it was a whole lot of black folk sat down on bus and they got thrown in jail and they did it way more close than these. Only difference between them and her is that she was secretary at the NAACP and she know Martin Luther King and they got a lot of publicity. That's all I'm saying.
To me, it sounds like you got a little haterism in your game.
Well, Kevin, there ain't no hateration or no holleration in this dance for you, okay? What I'm saying is that black people need to stop lying.
Say something.
It's three things that black people need to tell the truth about. One, Rodney King should have got an ass beat for driving drunk and being thrown in the Honda. Two, OJ did it. And three, Rosa Parks ain't do nothing but sit her black ass down.
Hey, I'm gonna back you up on that, because see, look, he was on the bus back in the day, and he on the bus now.
Eddie, not only is what you're saying not true, it's wrong and disrespectful for you to discuss Rosa Parks in that way.
Exactly. Wait, hold on here. Is this a barbershop? Is this a barbershop?
Yes,
it's a barbershop. I mean, we can't talk straight in the barbershop, then where can we talk straight? We can't talk straight nowhere else. This ain't nothing but healthy conversation.
You gotta tell Rosa Parks that.
Ain't nobody exempt in the barbershop, you know that. Ain't nobody exempt. You can talk about whoever and whatever, whenever you want to in the barbershop.
Wait a minute, you sound like this, Eddie. You know you're wrong. Keep on walking. You wrong. You're going back except this time, pal. I ain't with you. I'll tell you one thing. You better never let Jesse Jackson hear you talking about later.
Man, fuck Jesse Jackson.
So this is the typical scene that we think of when we think about black barbershops. This is the kind of shop that we tend to talk about, that we tend to sort of privilege. And so in the summer of 2000, Melissa Harris Perry, she was working on her first book, and she asked me to do an ethnography of a barbershop on the south side of Chicago for 3 months during that summer of 2000. Sat in the shop for about 4 to 5 days a week, and pretty much just observed the conversations happening in the shop. It was my first year of grad school in history, and I couldn't help but sort of think about the history of barbershops as I was sitting there in this space. Was this the kind? Certainly, this is the shop that I sat in Chicago was pretty similar to this, right? But I couldn't help but sort of wonder: was it like this in 1940? Was it like this in 1900? Well, what about 1840, right? we've made these assumptions about barbershops that have made them static in many ways. So I started to do some digging, right? First year seminar paper, right? Graduate seminar paper. Came across this barber named George Myers. George Myers was William McKinley's barber before McKinley was elected president in 1896 from Ohio. And Myers was, somehow entrenched in the Republican machine from Cleveland. So both McKinley and Marcus Hanna. Marcus Hanna was McKinley's, sort of handler. Let's say he was the 19th century Karl Rove, if you will, right? So he sort of organized things, helped raise money, etc. And so they tapped Myers to organize black voters in Ohio and around the country. Now, what's interesting, again, Myers shaved Marcus Hanna, Myers shaved William McKinley. And all of the customers in George Myers' barbershop were white. They were white businessmen and politicians, which was not the kind of barber I was looking for and thought I was fine, and certainly it sort of intrigued me. The other part here is that, once McKinley was elected president, Myers got a flood of letters from African Americans in Ohio, but also from the South, because they said, yeah, I see that McKinley was elected. I know that you're close with McKinley and the Republicans. Can you put in a good word for me for this position as the treasurer here in Mobile, Alabama? Can you get me a patronage job here in Arkansas? And so Myers became the sort of go-between African Americans and the Republican Party. Someone who did not engage in politics himself, but was indeed close to seats of power in some way. Again, quite intriguing. The third thing was that he had 6 microfilm reels of personal papers. And as a historian, that really intrigued me, right? And this was someone who at least was doing something, and I needed to sort of see and figure out this. But the sort of biggest question was, weren't there other folks like Myers who exclusively groomed white men? And certainly the reality was, yes, there were. And in fact, in the 19th century, a majority, if not all, and I say if not all because as a historian I just leave a little bit of room for something that I didn't find, of the black-owned commercial barbershops, they groomed white men. And so that's this 19th century story. Stacked against this 20th century story that looks similar to what we see in this film on Barbershop. Okay, stop there. 2003, I went to do some interviews in the South. Because one is, I still have some trouble making sense of these what they call colorblind barbers in the 19th century. I wanted to do some interviews of barbers who either owned or worked in a barbershop anytime before 1970. So I went south. I had very long dreadlocks at the time. It came to my waist. I expected the jokes. I expected the jobs. I expected all that, right? My grandfather was a barber. I'd spend time in barbershops to get my own hair, so no problem. But what I was surprised at the response. And so when I was in Atlanta, one barber said, how does it look that you want to talk to me about barbering and you haven't cut your hair in I don't know how long? Another barber said, I'm in the grooming business and you don't look groomed. Similar response. I got to Durham, and as the researcher that I am, as you all are, I wanted to turn the tables a bit. So one barber in Durham, North Carolina said, you've had trouble getting interviews, haven't you? So I lied. I said, no. Why do you say that? I was interested in his response. He goes, because we don't like that guy, right? If we were depending on people like you, we'd be out of business, right? So, yeah, but during the 60s, early 70s, afros and naturals were here, right? This shouldn't be new, right? Goes, yeah, but they were still coming in to get it trimmed. Others said, well, yeah, and it darn near put us out of business too, right? They didn't do interviews with me. I did get some other interviews, but those rejections said something to me that really sort of helped me think about barbershops historically, but also I think would help us think about these spaces much better. And that is, while we revere the sense of egalitarianism that supposedly happens in these barbershops and the nature of talk and discourse, these are businesses, right? And what those barbers were telling me was that, I kind of have to think about who's getting a haircut and who's going to get shaved and where the money's going to come from, right? Which in turn sort of helped me think more critically about those colorblind barbers who I wanted to write off, right, as conservative folks who were just trying to, as sort of conservative capitalists, right, sort of capitalists, if you will, right? No, actually it's much more complicated than that, right? And so what the book tries to do here is sort of think about the public sphere and the ways in which the market economy informs the public sphere, right? The sort of scholarship on the black public sphere sort of suggests that these are spaces that were disconnected from the state, disconnected from the market, right? The black church, for example, right? Not so much the case with barbershops, actually, right? The market is actually quite central, right, to what happens in this space, right? So what happens when the market economy informs the discourse, right? And so just to briefly sort of go back to the film, while the sort of public discourse was quite central, and indeed this got a lot of flack, particularly because of what was said about Rosa Parks, right? Jesse Jackson was upset, as you can imagine. Al Sharpton was upset. But a more, I think, complicated reading of that particular scene and the film itself is that, one, I like to think about barbershops in this sort of tripartite way. So you have the barber, the customer in the barber's chair, and this waiting public, right? This waiting public, men, women who are sitting in the waiting chairs, literally waiting to get a haircut, but also just there to hang out. You have to think about what's happening in the space. And so, yes, you can think about public discourse and public space, for sure. We can think about labor. We can think about entrepreneurship. We can think about how all that comes together, right? If we, again, sort of move those positions around. It's that sort of waiting public that, we get the guy coming to sell DVDs because he knows somebody's going to be sitting around the barbershop, right? He knows he can get potential clients or customers if he comes in the shop. It's that waiting public, right, where the public discourse is sort of fueled, right? Folks who are sitting there waiting. But also, I think it's important to sort of point out the intervals of labor. What I mean by the intervals of labor is that, as you saw from the scene, the barbers were in between customers. Right? So what happens during the intervals of labor when workers, right, have space or time in between their work, right? We can certainly apply that to all sorts of labor scenarios here, right? Think about sales clerks, right, when they don't have customers. What do they do during that interval? And certainly here with barbers, when they are cutting someone's hair, shaving someone, they have this space in between, right? So how can we sort of tease out those intervals of labor? And so that, again, I think that gets us to, again, what's special and significant about these barbershops. So this larger story, again, sort of moves us from the 19th century to the 20th, and I'm going to speak in more detail in a second, but that's the overall historical arc. And so what are some of the historical factors that move us from this 19th century story to this 20th century story, and then what do we sort of take from it? Ultimately, I sort of think about barbershops within the context of subsistence, right? In what ways did barbering, right, provide this sort of avenue for African American men and women, this sort of avenue towards freedom? In what ways did they establish some sense of economic security through barbering? In what ways did the shop itself serve as a kind of a safe haven, if you will, right? Outside of the strictures of Jim Crow, outside of the surveillances of the state. My larger argument is that black barbershops were private spaces in the public sphere, right? Private spaces in the sense that it's, for the most part, mostly men. When I say mostly men, not all men, for sure, historically, not all men. They also serve as, again, these sort of spaces where customers can sort of come in and relax, get haircuts, but also talk. And so this is what I want to sort of talk about here as I go through this work on barbershops. But I'm also going to segue to, I think, what barbershops can certainly tell us historically, right? Sort of moving outside the barbershop. And so the second half of this talk I'm gonna talk a bit about the ways in which civil rights activists organized to raise money, right? In what ways was fundraising, in what ways was subsistence sort of central to civil rights organizing? How can we think about African Americans' lives and livelihoods together? And I think that barbershops, but also the sort of networks of funding are intricately connected. And so I'm going to talk a bit about, again, as I call it, the wages of resistance, right? The wages that were critical to, say, a barbershop as laborers, but also wages in this sense of movement activism, right? If we think about activists as workers, what wages did they need to keep moving? What resources were required for them to keep moving? There's a way in which sort of, a material standard of living sort of adds security to life in some ways in this sort of most existential sense, but also to the very tenets of American democracy. And so in thinking about these 19th century barbers who were quite wealthy, many African American men entered barbering as enslaved folk because they served as sort of personal care attendants to masters. They were on a plantation. As sort of skilled workers, they were also sort of hired out, right? They were hired out and they worked in the barbershops owned by free black men, right? So, antebellum period, you find, particularly in the South, you'll find black-owned barbershops owned by free black men. In these shops, you find both free black and enslaved men in the shop together, which I think is an interesting sort of mix here. Now, and again, white men go into these shops. White men didn't want to be barbers because they associated barbering with slave labor, associated with sort of menial manual labor, which of course they thought was beneath them. Now, let me just sort of give you this sort of visual here. If you've read Herman Melville's Bleeding Sereno, you'll see where I'm going with this. Just imagine this white man, plantation owner, politician, whatever, sitting in the chair of a black barber, 1840s, 1850s. This black barber has what? Straight razor to this dude's neck, right? So you have to wonder, what would possess a white man to submit his neck week in and week out to a black man in a shop full of other black men? He had to, and did, believe in the fantasies of racial inferiority. They had to believe that the barber was incapable of slitting his throat, right? In the same way that white households had to believe that their black domestics were incapable of poisoning the family, of harming their children. They had to believe in this fantasy, right? And that's why they did. They believed that nothing would happen to them, even if they submitted their throats week in, week out to a black barber, right? So there's a way in which we can, again, sort of understand why, a black barber in, 1840 South Carolina, North Carolina, would sort of be forced and have to capitulate to the wishes of their white customers, right? White men didn't want to be shaved next to a black man being shaved. It would have sort of smacked too much of social equality for them, right? And so there's a way in which I sort of talk about these barbers as, so let me just sort of step back. This was an avenue for freedom for them, right? So they, again, made quite a bit of money doing this. Those who were enslaved, some were actually able to purchase their freedom from the wages that they made shaving white men. Others, like William Johnson in Natchez, Mississippi, who left this 1,000-page diary talking about his time as a barber. Again, made quite a bit of money. But these barbers they also had their pulse on white society in a way that was quite useful. For example, for fugitive slaves, right? So when enslaved folk were fleeing plantations and they were trying to find space, after hours, after the shop would close, there are tons of stories of barbers sort of opening their door after hours when their white customers were not there to provide some safe haven before, you know, they could continue on their journey north. Tons of examples of barbers informing those who were away and hiding somewhere that there was a slave patrol, right, who was looking for so-and-so. You better get moving because they're up here looking for you, right? And so barbers, much like African Americans who worked in hotels, right, they had a sense of white travel in a way, right? And they provided this kind of sort of information networks, right? Now you might sort of wonder what African Americans like Frederick Douglass and others sort of thought about, right? This, and we know that Douglass was quite, how should I say, forceful in sort of putting forth the idea that African Americans had to leave behind trades that were servile, right? And so Douglass just sort of railed in his newspaper, railed against black barbers, saying, look, we have to leave these sort of servile positions, professions behind, right? We have to sort of establish ourselves in trades that befit a sort of a manly profession, a manly people, right? What's interesting, though, is that the very middle class that Douglass was trying to advocate for, those black barbers were part of that middle class, right? They were part of that middle class. And so there's this sort of pushback between these, again, colorblind barbers and the black middle class and black reformers, right? Who, again, sort of want to think about this sort of masculine understanding of the social organization of labor, right? In some ways, Douglass gave black barbers in the South a pass. It's slavery, I get it. The black barbers in the North was where he sort of targeted much of his critique. But again, these barbers were quite active in abolition circles. They were quite active in political conventions. They're all over the sort of 19th century politics. And so it's not easy to sort of categorize them. After emancipation, again, we get a similar story here, right? The 1880s, 1890s, again, very similar practice that was happening in the North in the antebellum period happens in the South in the post-emancipation period. Free blacks at this point, certainly grooming white men, making money at it, and this is where George Myers comes out of, right? He sort of came of age in the 1880s, 1890s, along with Alonzo Herndon in Atlanta, John Merrick in Durham. What's interesting is that both of those barbers, Herndon in Atlanta, used the profits from his barbershop to found Atlanta Life Insurance Company. John Merrick used the profits from his shop to found North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, right? There's a way in which what they sort of couldn't do in their shop, they were actually able to do for black communities in other respects. Herndon, though, was actually much more politically engaged than Merrick was. Herndon was a part of the founding meeting of the Niagara movement that Du Bois established, helped establish. And so we see Herndon engaging in much more political activities than we do John Merrick. But again, like this was the sort of prevailing view here. And you know, what's interesting is that if you look at the Southern City directories, and those city directories at the time, you know, this is the nature of segregation, Jim Crow, they marked a C next to the black C for color, next to black business owners and residents. So you can pick up a Southern City directory, you know, late 19th century, most of the 20th century. And if you're doing some whatever research you're doing, if you find that city directories might be helpful for you, they're actually quite wonderful resources because they sort of lay out, again, the sort of racial makeup of a particular city. And so looking through those directories, again, black barbers, black, mostly black, like a good 95 to 98% of the barbers in the South were black. In the North, the percentage is different because we had a good number of German and Italian barbers, particularly with New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. And so what's really interesting here is that this period between 1890 and 1930 is this moment of change, right? So if black barbers were, again, sort of situated in downtown business districts serving white men, One, you might certainly ask, well, where did black women get their haircut? Get shaved on somebody's front porch, in somebody's house, right? In these sort of non-commercial spaces. Things changed dramatically from 1890 to 1930. One is that the German barbers particularly founded a barbers union in 1887. And essentially, they're trying to, this is the issue of competition here. Downtown business district, they're trying to sort of get this lucrative market away from black men. They said, now you should actually go to a barber college to be able to, enter the trade. So the Barbers Union lobbied several states for licensing laws, right? To say that go to barber college, as you can imagine, black men weren't allowed to get into the barber college, that you had to know the anatomy of the body, right? You can't just pick up some scissors and start cutting, right? You have to actually know something about the body and lice and disease and all that stuff. If there was ever a time where they were trying to get back to the sort of age or time of the barber surgeon, it was certainly here, right? And this is the same progressive era moment where public health sort of emerges as a profession, right? Where the American Medical Association is established, the American Bar Association is established, and so this barbers union is trying to attach itself onto that association movement to create some sort of exclusivity about who could become a barber, right? Or who could become a barber. I mentioned something about skill. And so the other factor here that I think is really important is the Gillette safety razor was mass produced beginning in 1903. Most men went to the barbershop to get shaved. But once men can shave themselves much better at home, much easier at home, cutting hair took on much more, again, of social significance. Meaning, white barbers, German barbers, and particularly native white barbers who started entering barbering, said, well, black men, they're good at shaving, but it takes more skill to cut hair, right? Now you say, what's the issue with shaving? Well, it was seen as more feminine, because you're touching a man's face. And that's what they would often reference, that, well, black men, they're, again, sort of adept at, doing this sort of menial, effeminate work, but the skilled work should be reserved for white folks. And that's one of the arguments that they tried to use, again, to sort of gain some entry into the trade. This other sort of major factor here, I think, is sort of internal to black communities. Because this new generation of African men entered barbering in the 1890s and 1900s. And they actually did not want to shave white men. They actually wanted to open up shops in black communities. Certainly, this is a moment where Jim Crow's on the rise, for sure, and being codified. But there was a really sort of marked decision to open up new shops in black communities because of the sort of really valuable work that sort of happened there, right? And so there's a way in which these things sort of work to sort of push black barbers from downtown in the 1910s, 1920s. Two couple of quick cases where I think about the licensing law. From 1902 to 1933, the Ohio State Legislature, again, at the behest of the Barbers Union, tried to push a licensing law. Major reason that it took so long to get passed was because George Myers, who I mentioned earlier, had made such signal connections in Republican politics that he was actually able to convince the Republican legislature from passing the bill, right? Because he said, now, if you pass this bill, I'm going to tell all black voters not to vote the Republican ticket. So it's up to you. Do what you want, as if he really had that kind of power and control, but it was enough to actually keep it at bay. Coincidentally enough, Myers died in 1933, and that following legislature, it passed. Virginia, from 1924 to 1962, again, took a while to pass for different reasons. What's interesting about Virginia is that the state legislatures in Virginia didn't want to pass it. And certainly many black barbers said, this is going to push us out of the tree. This is an act to kick us out. Why do you think a southern legislature, Virginia, would actually listen to such an argument from African Americans? They didn't want to lose their black barber. They didn't want to lose their own black barbers, right? They didn't want to lose their own quote-unquote black servants, right? They had lost the cause, if you will, right? The Old South, that was gone, right? Something that sort of reminded them of the Old South was indeed having a black barber. And so it took a while for that to pass. It finally passed in '62, largely because there was a new set of black barbers who were actually more concerned that black barbers from DC were coming into Virginia because there was no licensing law, no regulation, and there was competition between. It was about hair processing, actually. So the barbers in Virginia were concerned that the barbers in DC were slipping over into Virginia, taking over their customers in hair processing. So black barbers in Virginia said, we need a law, we gotta keep them out. And so it finally sort of passed there. What we get sort of going into the 20th century is a sort of black barbershop sort of centrally situated in black communities. And quite central to the work that black communities did in terms of developing community formations, right? And so, interestingly, in the 1930s, Depression, of course, and the numbers racket was run through grocery stores and certainly through barbershops. Now, that helped the owner, right? Men are getting getting haircuts less often, but they are hanging out in barbershops. The owner often got a cut of the numbers, but those who weren't the sort of workers, they didn't get a cut. In the 1930s, we see all sorts of labor strike in barbershops because those who were not owners actually weren't making a whole lot. The owners they were subsidized in some way from the numbers racket. And so again, right, it's an interesting space to think about independent labor, not wage labor, right? Because these weren't wage workers. Even those who didn't own the shop, they were not wage workers. When someone got a shave or got a haircut, the barber took a percentage and gave another percentage to the owner. But the barber could actually leave the shop at will. And more likely than not, his customer or customers would go with him, right? And so that level of trust between barber and patron is quite central, right, to this barber-patron relationship, right? That level of trust, which again gave, I think, even those who were not owners, gave him so much power, right, in ways that a wage worker had to do a lot more to sort of gain. If that makes any sense. And so what's sort of clear here, right, is that once we get to the civil rights movement, and we know that the black church was quite central to civil rights organizing, without a doubt. Tons of work done on that, indisputable. Barbershops also served as this sort of way station, if you will, this sort of movement halfway house, to sort of use origins of civil rights, Alden Morris's term. And so what we see in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is African American barbers who are either active in the NAACP or active in SNCC, sort of using their shops, right, as spaces of organizing. What we also see is that folks becoming politicized when they were coming to get a haircut, right? Reading either leftist or radical literature, talking about campaigns, they sort of gained this sort of political education in barbershops. And that's what's sort of interesting about this sort of private space in the public sphere, right, during Jim Crow, because that's, folks, black men didn't have to worry about the state sort of looking over their shoulder, right? They could have this sort of enclave inside the barbershop. And certainly beauty shops worked in the same way. Right? So I just want to sort of say that there. But what's sort of fascinating here is that there's several barbers that I saw through my research there who talk about feeling free and open to contribute to civil rights campaigns because they were not beholden to a white employer, and they would not be beholden to white customers, right? And this sort of raised some really interesting, this is for the most part, as I see these stories in the late 50s and early 60s. And this is a time where in the sort of the moment of the Cold War, where southern states had begun to sort of put substantial pressure on the NAACP, and then started to sort of prohibit the NAACP from actually existing in some southern states, where folks were being fired, right, because they were signing petitions or trying to restrict the vote. So economic reprisals were quite central to the kinds of repression that African Americans faced in the South during civil rights organizing. And you have these barbers, right, allowing SNCC to sort of have a meeting space in the back of the shop, or barbers like C.C. Bryant in Mississippi, again, using his shop as the sort of meeting space and organizing space. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because it sort of that's a good segue into the second part of this story here. But sort of briefly, as it sort of moved to the sort of the end of the book here, barbershops were not, so black barbershops were not black because of Jim Crow, right? They were not spaces because, important spaces simply because African Americans couldn't get a haircut in white barbershops. If you can sort of imagine a line of black men outside of a white barbershop waiting to get their afros trimmed and to talk about the Black Panther Party. Probably not going to happen in white barbershop, right? Probably would not have happened. Nonetheless, right, there were many sort of student movements, college students who were affiliated with CORE and some with SNCC, who tried to desegregate white barbershops. Not to get a haircut in these shops, excuse me, but to say that I don't want to go in there, but you're not going to tell me I can't go in there, right? And so the desegregation of white barbershops actually tells us something about what was happening and the significance of black barbershops, right? So at the dawn of integration, right, when the integration of Major League Baseball sort of spelled the decline of the Negro League baseball league, where department stores, right, began to allow Americans to come in and purchase, where grocery stores, right, those sort of spaces of integration. Here's the sort of problem here. There's a difference between, say, commodity-based and service-based businesses, right? So with a grocery store, you're buying a roll of toilet paper, for example, right? Price doesn't so much matter, right? So it would be cheaper to go to the big A&P store, right? It's cheaper to get toilet paper there. You might care about the softness of it, right? But with the haircut, right, a service, it's not the same kind of a commodity, right? Where you're not just going to go to any barber, right? Again, that trust and that intimacy matter, right? And so at the dawn of integration, black folk were still going to black barbershops, as they were still going to black churches, and still going to, and still go to, right, black beauty salons, largely because of willing congregation, right? Again, they were willingly congregating in these spaces because of the production of black culture that was happening within barbershops that they could not get elsewhere, right? And so that helps us think more critically, right, about these notions of segregation and separation and integration, right? I often, sort of have my students think about this term self-segregation, and if you've read Beverly Tatum's Why Do All the Black Kids Sit at the Cafeteria Together, it's a good sort of intuitive to think about this. When in fact we don't usually ask why do all the white kids sit together. But this term self-segregation is a bankrupt term, right? And that's largely because we don't think critically about the term segregation, right? It wasn't a choice, right? Folks weren't choosing, right, to restrict their own mobility, right? It was forced. So you can't force yourself to restrict your own mobility. It doesn't make any sense, right? Self-segregation is not a term, it's a bankrupt term, right? It's a sense of willing congregation. Now, sure, there's a way in which if we think about the dialectic to segregation, right? Meaning, when I say dialectic, I mean sort of two opposing forces coming together to create some larger synthesis, right? Two opposing forces, right? So, one, segregation itself. Two, willing congregation, right? Creating these black communities that we see and know of today, right? And so that's a much more nuanced way to sort of think about it, but also a much more nuanced way to sort of think about sort of spaces that we inhabit today. And we prefer, some of us, right, prefer to go to, again, a black barber, a black beautician. One, because I, kind of know that they're going to know how to cut my hair, right? I don't have to explain a whole lot. But, we also know that, again, there's certainly much more that happens in that space. It's not just about the haircut, but it's about this part of the community that could be egalitarian and could not be, right? And so during this sort of moment of Afros and Naturals, what we see is that barbers said, look, many barbers said, I can't stand those Afros and Naturals because I'm not making enough money, right? I'm going to be out of business. And so thinking about both individual and collective interests together, I think, is quite central to sort of complicate, right, how we think about these spaces, right? So they're not egalitarian by nature. They could be, but the barber, right? The barbers had a huge stake in whether or not these spaces would be egalitarian or would not be. And I think now we see much more, many more shops that are appointment only or really sort of class-based, which is starting to change a bit. So that sort of opens up things. So again, I want to come back very briefly, sort of again, to help us go outside the barbershop a bit, to think about the significance of how black livelihoods are situated in social movements. And so I want to sort of come here to Fannie Lou Hamer, because I think she really sort of understood the significance of welfare and subsistence in ways that are just quite powerful. And this is a quote from Hamer as she was sort of thinking about her own life and experience and her entry into organizing, but also the significance of money and the flow of money. Here in the Delta part of Mississippi, I've just barely existed. Not really lived, because coming from a farming family, I can tell you what it's like to suffer for things that are essential in order for one to survive throughout these economical and social changes. So many times as a child I've gone hungry, and now as an adult I'm still hungry. It was one of the greatest things that ever happened in the state of Mississippi when the voter registration crusade began. This was in 1961 in Mississippi. And at the behest of SNCC, Fannie Lou Hamer did actually try to go register to vote. Her actions, she was rebuffed at the courthouse. Her actions landed her off of the plantation that she had been working on. So she was kicked off the land simply because she went to try to register to vote. She kicked off the land that she had worked on for a good number of years, and that sort of entered her sort of career activist work, if you will. And so Hamer would sort of go on to say that, quote, we need to change Mississippi. I'm sick of being hungry, naked, and looking at my children and so many other children crying for bread. While Hamer's she talked about sort of substandard existence, it's powerful enough. She didn't want people to simply show pity for the poor, hungry folks in the Delta. She wanted people to provide necessary resources to fuel this burgeoning movement. She said, quote, it takes a lot of things to keep an organization going. We don't have transportation, so we need cars, food, clothing, and most of all, money, which would help greatly in our struggle for freedom. It is very important that we get to all the people whenever necessary. I'm married and have 2 daughters whose ages are 19 and 10. My work keeps me away from my family most of the time, and transportation is needed greatly. If I had a car, I could get to more people in a much shorter period. Now, transportation needs were acute throughout SNCC's work in rural areas, right? The image of SNCC field secretaries going door to door to speak with residents was more complicated than those still photos that we see. But individuals might have lived sort of 8 to 10 miles apart, right? And so cars would need to sort of get to them, but also transport them to the courthouse. With sort of more material and non-material resources, Hamer believed that SNCC could operate more efficiently that they could help meet the basic needs of people that they wanted to organize. But also, Hamer wanted to be closer to family, right? And so those other resources were going to help her, right, do that activist work, but also not be so disconnected from her family. What we see, and so what sort of comes out of Hamer's work and SNCC's work is that this larger sort of focus and need to think about resources and money, right? Think about the larger political ideologies of citizenship and voting. We don't think about the sort of quotidian ways that it took to make those things happen, right? We don't think about the finances, the money that was critical, right? To purchase cars, to bail folks out of jail, right? To support the activists who were fired from their jobs. This is what's, again, important for us as scholars to begin to delve more deeply into, to sort of think about the money, but also particularly the ways in which money was critical to movement building and movement organizing. And so while SNCC was in the Delta, I'm going to wrap up in about 5 to 6 minutes. While SNCC was in the Delta, trying to register folks to vote, the Flora and Sunflower County supervisors decided to take retribution on Black residents in the Delta by withdrawing from the federal food surplus program, right? You want to register to vote? All right. Took away the sort of welfare assistance, right? In between cotton seasons was this sort of moment where Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers needed the most assistance because they just didn't have money coming in, they didn't have anything coming in. Stacked onto the larger debt that was held against them during the regular cotton season. So that was all sort of compounded. And so the food surplus program was sort of one space that they could actually get some food in between the cotton seasons. Well, Flora County, Sunflower County sort of took that away, which also meant that SNCC is in the South, is in the Delta, and trying to convince folks to register. But they're like, I hear you, but I don't have food, right? Not only do I not have food, but if I try to go register, I'm going to be fired. And so, how are you going to help me in my immediate livelihoods, right? And so SNCC authorized this Food for Freedom program. And this Food for Freedom program essentially was this fundraising effort that they sent out a call to the North to raise food and clothing for African Americans in the South as a way to address these subsistence needs, right? So the SNCC, the Friends of SNCC affiliates in the North, which was set up in the North primarily to raise money. Their job was to raise money and to send it south. They helped to organize benefit concerts along with Harry Belafonte, who gave tons and tons of money and helped to organize benefit concerts. They organized Black business folk to raise and give money, but also organized sort of working class folk, right? Those who didn't have a lot to give but gave anyway. Helps us think about sacrifice and giving outside of philanthropy. Philanthropy with the big P, the foundations, they gave a lot of money. But Black folk gave quite a bit too, right? And I think looking at those sort of small contributions will help us think about contributions versus donations. I make a distinction here, right? Foundations donated money. They were not so connected to these movements. Black folk contributed money. It was a connection, right? They contributed. So I make a distinction between contribution and donation. And so SNCC got tons of support, right? And SNCC and certainly the folks in Delta, tons of support, right? Food and clothing started flowing south in significant ways. And this was the first time that SNCC had realized that they couldn't just focus on the vote, but they had to focus on the substance of people's lives, right? And it's the first time that I think they sort of saw the significance of welfare outside of the state, right? So certainly there's a way in which the state wasn't providing, so the state was helping, but throughout so from 63 on through the late 60s, right, activists were organizing organizations that had the sole purpose of raising money. For example, Ella Baker organized the Foundation for Educational and Legal Defense, right? Where she thought about those big activists who like left school for a year or two. Well, they have to go back. And she said they're going to need money, right? They need scholarship money to get back in school, right? So someone like Ella Baker was actually quite visionary, right, in thinking about the welfare of movements, but also the welfare of people's lives, right? And she helped to raise money, right, again, to give those students some money to get back in school and to continue that work. I'm going to end here, but I sort of, again, it might seem sort of disparate here, thinking about fundraising, also thinking about barbershops, but I argue here that with both of these sort of projects here, right, it helps us sort of centralize financial well-being and centralize the subsistence that I think is quite critical to movement building, but also one's everyday quotidian life, again, that we tend to take for granted. So, love to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. Please.
First of all, appreciate you, Dr. Mills, really interesting talk. Just want to throw out something. You speak, of course, about Barbary as a space of kind of autonomous, a bit of independent black wealth generation, and then also on the other side, the ways in which movements are being financed. What about the kind of, I guess I'm more so thinking on the other side of this, what about state repression against these kind of financing efforts? Do you find any evidence of that? If so, what type of things are being done to kind of upend these attempts to create some type of financial autonomy, which again creates the political autonomy?
Sure. The major sort of state level repression actually came through the federal government and the IRS, right? And so if these organizations like the one that several that Ella Baker started, if they were not sort of tax exempt, right, then they actually could not raise money. They had to go through, say, another organization to raise money who would indeed disperse funds, right? So SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, came through. So they actually had to set up a separate nonprofit to raise money because of tax issues. And so there are cases where the IRS has essentially put some of these organizations under surveillance, right, to see if, again, if they had registered as nonprofits or not. So yeah, that's a sort of a quick answer. Other than that, right, one other way that the state tried to, so for example, the Food for Freedom program, where folks in the North sort of drove shipments of that food and clothing from the North south. And so often you find that, particularly in Mississippi, the police would stop them, right? There's a case where, pretty famous case where Ivan O. Donaldson and Ben Taylor from the University of Michigan State. They had driven food and clothing down. They had some first aid supplies in that shipment. They were arrested for transporting drugs, which was just basically aspirin, right? So that was another way in which, again, the state might get involved, sort of interrupt that. Other than that, right, there wasn't much else the state could do, right? So when we're talking about benefit concerts, there's not much to do there. Again, Harry Belafonte was quite instrumental in sort of organizing folks, organizing black celebrities and white celebrities and the right level. But so yes, there was actually a run around. Certainly the hard part was actually raising the money, but continuously raising the money, right? And so that was probably the most difficult aspect. Please.
Hi. Thank you for coming out and sharing with us the contents of your book. I just had a question on the community around the barbershop. You also talked about the different levels that go along with that. So my question is, in this technological age, there are several websites and pages, posts dedicated just for male or female grooming, hairstyles, how to do it yourself from home. And so they become both like the person in the chair and the person performing the work. And I noticed in the community, like in the comment section, many people don't post like political things or say political things as you would in a shop. So do you feel like we're missing that sense of community in this technological age?
Great question. And the short answer is yes. I've certainly seen that. Well, one, I'll say that, folks will still go to barbershops. Yeah, some folks will, shave, probably, I'm not sure if Nick actually goes to a barbershop to shave his head, but probably shave, does himself, right? Because it's quite easy to do. If you want to keep some hair and cut it a little bit, then you have to go to a professional because it's just difficult to, you have to mirror and it's just tough. Folks will always need haircuts, right? The fashions will change, of course, but folks will still go. I have noticed though, that even in, well, I don't hang out in barbershops, so I don't have time these days, but when I am there, I have noticed that lots of folks are on their phones. They're texting or they're looking at Facebook or Twitter or whatever, right? So they're not actually talking to folks who are in front of them. So I've noticed that as a big change. There are many shops who are going to appointment only, which means that, that waiting public is starting to, dissipate a little bit. So that's certainly changing. And so I would certainly agree with you that, but indeed, there are tons of barbershops that are still sort of bustling a bit. Some are facing huge pressures from city sort of economic development organizations in many cities who, don't so much like a bunch of men hanging out in front of, sort of on the sidewalk in front of the barbershop, right?
Yeah.
And so this is about walking space, right? It's about walking city, which means that especially it's comfortable for white people to walk around.
Yeah.
And having a bunch of men on the corners just doesn't. So I'm also noticing that many sort of economic development organizations are trying to find ways to, to move barbershops out or, convince the leaseholders not to renew some of these leases. But again, which is a shame because barbershop, like there's low barriers to entry to own a barbershop, right? When I say own, I really sort of mean lease, right? Most of these shops are leased, but to be your own boss, if you will, right? So it's been an avenue historically, right, for black men and women to sort of enter into and to have some sense of independence, which I think is really, really important. But to your question about the nature of community, I think it's certainly changing. I would absolutely agree
I appreciate your talk. I found the kind of your rejection of the term self-segregation compelling. Now I wonder about some of the dynamics of the movement of people today and whether you can kind of speak to maybe the 21st century may have a scope for barbershops, particularly black barbershops. So here in Greater Austin, there's a real gentrification pull that's kind of suburbanizing poverty, I'm sure you've heard of. And with that suburbanization, there's obviously a racial element to that at least the communities of color kind of being on the outskirts often. And of course, we've seen this throughout the country. What do you think may happen to the black barbershops that are very often within the city if are they going to move to the outskirts? Do you think that there are any economic results from that? What have you seen and what do you expect?
Based on the sort of history that I know of suburbanization of both white and black flight and reverse flight, even when black folk are pushed out or moved out, they go back to the church. They go back to the barbershop, they go back to the beauty shop, right? So even though, right, that movement might be happening, again, once you find a barber petition that you like, you're going to keep going, unless you completely move out of the city, right? Move out of the state, right? Then you find somebody new. or if you're blonde, you just have a barber guns, right? And so I actually don't, like, I think those shops will certainly stay. In places like Harlem, and it's an interesting question, what I'm more interested in actually is whether or not, say, think about Harlem and the gentrification of Harlem, if many of those white residents, for example, or exceptionally wealthy black residents too, and I want to be essentials here, right, begin to go into these barbershops. What might happen when you begin to see whites, go to the neighborhood barbershop that's a black barbershop? I think that's a question that I don't have an answer to, but I'm really interested to see what gentrification might have to the space inside the shop, as opposed to what's going to happen to the shop itself. I think the shop will still be there. I think folks will still go back to the barbershop, to their particular shop. The question, though, is, I think this is probably more to your point, is it might be the case that those shops might be priced out, right? Property taxes are moving up, and again, the powers that be say we want a certain kind of business on this thoroughfare, and this barbershop ain't quite fitting. Then let's, maybe I can have a high-end, I don't know, small Nordstrom rack here instead of a barbershop, right? They're going to jack the rent up, and of course, the barber's not going to be able to stay. So that's probably more likely to happen. I haven't seen the evidence that I haven't sort of done work on that, but I can certainly see that potentially taking place. And folks essentially, those barbers possibly move into other parts of the city.
You talked about your experience going with dreadlocks and the response that barbers had to you. And I don't go to a barber to get my head shaved, but occasionally when I was in Brooklyn, I would go to this one Caribbean spot to have them trim my beard because I didn't have clippers. And I noticed that a couple of the barbers that worked there had locks. And they were younger as well. But they were also in Fort Greene, so they got priced out from like a real prime spot to one on the back street, and then I think they're gone now. But I'm just wondering, does the generation and the demographics even amongst black, so Caribbean barbers from Brooklyn as opposed to, say, African American in Atlanta or Durham, does that factor into kind of the cultural politics and maybe even the way they respond to politics? And I guess I'm asking that as a way to ask, do you see room for, say, barbers or beauty shops to have the same kind of either facilitating role or cultural role in like maybe Black Lives Matter that you see in previous generations or previous moments in the movement? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, because and certainly as you pointed out, geography matters, right? So, barbershops in Harlem are different from Chicago, right? You don't get a large sort of West Indian population in Chicago, for example, right? So they're going to be different. It's not static. They're going to be different. Sort of the kind of politics that sort of gets engaged in is going to be different based on the folks who are in there, for sure, right? So the short answer to your first question is, yeah, I think when you have a place like New York City, when you're talking about Fort Greene or whatever, you will certainly, I think you just sort of have to have this more robust political engagement that's not U.S. based, that's not even simply Caribbean based, but actually is much more diasporic, right? That just has to happen, right? Whether folks are talking about a cricket match or talking about Venus and Serena tennis in the U.S., I think it's just there, right? I haven't done that work, and I don't think anyone has done that work actually, but I think it would be really sort of fascinating. The role that sort of I think barbershops might play in thinking about Black Lives Matter is really important. And I'm surprisingly actually going to say I'm not sure that barbershops would play actually a huge role in Black Lives Matter. And I'll say that because
social media, I think, is much more critical to Black Lives Matter than the brick and mortar movement halfway house that the church was for the 50s and 60s and certainly before, right? Or the barbershops, this sort of static place where, you know, okay, we're gonna have a meeting at the church at 5 o'clock and folks are gonna go. No, I don't think that should be not happening with Black Lives Matter, right? And folks are on the internet, right? They're on Twitter, they're on, you know, other sort of spaces, Instagram. They're communicating in that way, and they're raising money in that way, right? And so over the past, say, 3 months or so, I've been really excited and encouraged to see tons of sort of calls to raise money for bail for Black Lives Matter activists who were arrested or were going to be arrested. So there is a Black Lives Matter bail fund. And there's also, I think, as you've certainly seen through the New York Times, there's more and more attention on the institution of bail, right, and the ways in which bail has been used to essentially keep Black folk confined in this larger criminal justice system, right? And so I've seen many more sort of public sort of articles in the New York Times and other political magazines sort of talking about the inequality in the bail system. And so Black Lives Matter folk have been raising money in advance of some of their protests, right? Anticipating needing money for bail. But I've seen that through social media, right? Folks don't have to go to tons of barbershops to say, you know, we need help with bail. It's actually quite not all that efficient. And so I'm not sure that barbershops actually will play a huge role in Black Lives Matter. I'm not sure that, say, young folk are really as attached to barbershops or beauty shops in this case. Certainly, I'll say Black Lives Matter was started by women, right? Although women do go to barbershops for sure, but I think they don't think they care about barbershops in the ways that I think you know, an older generation of African Americans did. And some still do. That's not to say that they may not play a single role. I think certainly that space is there, but a significant role, I don't think so. I don't think so. And I actually think that's okay. I think I'm not quite certain that I actually believe that. I'm hesitant to. I'm just not there with a social media movement. And that's not to reduce Black Lives Matter to a social media movement. It's not. And let me just sort of be clear here. Because folks actually do get together in person, clearly, right? But there's a way in which I think, and thinking about the ways in which, say, King and Jim Foreman with SNCC, the ways in which they raise money, and they sort of talked about it, right? They made public, they distributed literature about what they were doing, right? So this money is helping, you know, with bail because we know what just happened in Birmingham. And we needed that for Birmingham. And we're gearing up for this. And this is what the everyday activists, the everyday resident activists are going through. We need assistance to help them. They were distributing that sort of information in ways that somehow you have to be plugged in to get that information from Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, they are distributing it, right? But I found that I have to actively find the sort of Twitter feed to get that information. Otherwise, right, I do have to donate just for the cause, just for what I know this is about. I know what Black Lives Matter is about, but if you take someone who may not know the ins and outs, they may be less likely to give because they're wondering, well, what am I giving for, right? I think what we know about the history of criminalizing Black folk is that it can get quite individualistic, right, as opposed to societal, which means that there's a way in which the Black Lives Matter movement sort of began by focusing on Black men who were killed but unarmed, right? How does that movement look by supporting Black men who were also killed and armed by the police, right? I understand it. It's you know, all movements need some kind of respectability sort of bent here, right? So I simply get that. But I think it should sort of encourage us just to sort of, again, think broadly about what's happening in the movement and so forth. But again, let me just say that no one can sort of debate or doubt the work that these young folk have done and are doing. And we'd be fools not to call it a movement. We'd be fools to sort of invalidate it. We can't do that because they're going to still do that work. And so I think we should begin to understand. As historians, right, it's sort of too close to me to really get a sense. I mean, it's happening now. And so as a historian, sort of be distant to sort of make full sense of it. That's just kind of how we sort of think. Nonetheless, you know, for what's going on now, it's needed, and I'm glad that folks are stepping up doing their work. It's a very long, rounded way of answering your